Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we are going to try to tackle like a really big one. We're
Yeah.
talking about these escalating trade tensions that seem to be happening everywhere.
Yeah, it seems like it's
And specifically, we're going to zero in on China's record-breaking global trade surplus
wow.
and this new wave of tariffs. Some of them have already happened, others are just threats.
Right.
But they're all coming from the United States under President Trump's second term.
Okay.
I have to say, the stuff that you sent in for this is really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
You've got news articles. There's a really lively discussion happening over on Reddit.
I saw that.
And then also some official statements. So
Yeah.
it's kind of a really good mix. And our mission today is to try to kind of cut through all the noise,
Yeah, absolutely.
get to the heart of what this surplus actually means.
Yeah.
Why are these tariffs being put in place?
Right.
And what could the potential ripple effect be? I mean, this could affect all of us.
Well, yeah, and what's really interesting is I think the sources that we have today
Yeah.
really show like a bunch of different viewpoints on this whole situation.
Yeah.
We've got details about China's huge trade surplus.
Right.
And we kind of get a glimpse into some of the thinking behind it. Like, are they thinking about being dominant in global trade?
Uh-huh.
And, how are they responding to all this economic pressure from the U.S.?
Yeah.
That Reddit thread is just amazing.
It is so good.
It's like this real-time view
Yeah.
of like, what are people thinking and feeling?
Yeah.
And there's some pretty strong opinions in there about like dumping
Yeah.
and just what does this mean for everybody else's economies?
Yeah.
And then, of course, on the other side of things, we have the U.S. tariff actions.
Right.
And that includes all the specifics,
Yeah.
like what is this reciprocal tariff policy
Right.
and what are the actual numbers? What are the rates for different countries and different products?
Yeah.
And then on top of all of that, we'll be looking at the reactions. What do economists think?
Yeah.
What are other countries around the world saying?
Uh,
How about Chinese exporters themselves?
yeah.
And all of this is happening, against the backdrop of this kind of complicated geopolitical landscape.
Okay. So let's just jump right into it.
Let's do it.
Let's start with this record trade surplus that China has managed to build.
Okay.
The Semaphore article was the one that really got that Reddit thread going.
Oh, yeah.
And it points out just how big this surplus is.
It's huge.
The person who posted it on Reddit suggested that, all these kind of aggressive export strategies
Right.
that China is using, it's not just about selling a bunch of stuff.
Right.
They think it's really about becoming like the #1 player in global trade
Wow.
and creating a buffer against any economic pressure that the U.S. might be trying to put on them.
Interesting.
What were some of the reactions that jumped out at you?
Well, I think what's really interesting is the sheer, range of different concerns that people are bringing up,
Yeah.
So in the Reddit discussion, there's this worry that this could cause real instability in international markets.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah. And then also they're worried about, all this stuff is being exported.
Yeah.
What about the countries that are on the receiving end of it? Like, are they being harmed?
Right.
Are their own industries being hurt?
Uh-huh.
And then also this idea of, could other countries become too dependent on China,
Oh, yeah.
economically?
Economically, yeah.
So there are a lot of different worries there.
And, I mean, it's Reddit, right?
Exactly. So,
There'd be debate.
of course, there's going to be some real debate there. And there was.
For sure.
One user, Jerry Mandarling, questioned whether it's even possible for a country to just keep selling things at a loss,
Yeah.
indefinitely. You would think they would go bankrupt at some point.
Yeah, you'd think so. But then Ducky 181 comes in and they bring up this idea of dumping
Right.
and predatory pricing.
Yeah.
And then they make a really interesting point. They talk about how the WTO
Oh.
has actually in the past used prices from third countries
Interesting.
to try to figure out a fair market value for Chinese goods.
Yeah, that is interesting.
So it gets pretty complicated.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Dumping, which just means you're selling stuff for less than it costs to make.
Yeah.
Or less than you would sell it for in your own country.
Right.
That can be an actual strategy,
Yeah.
especially if the government is supporting it.
Yeah.
And the fact that, the WTO has had to use this third country pricing thing
Yeah.
shows that other countries are aware of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
They know that something's kind of funky about this.
They're watching.
Exactly.
Right.
And the fact that they have to use these kind of roundabout ways to figure out what Chinese goods are actually worth
Uh-huh.
says a lot, I think.
It says a lot about the Chinese economy, yeah.
Yeah.
There was another really interesting perspective in that thread.
Okay.
from a user called Shadowfax12221.
Okay.
They were basically saying that maybe China should focus more on getting its own people to buy more stuff, rather than just constantly trying to have this bigger and bigger trade surplus.
Oh, so instead of focusing on exports,
Yeah.
focus on domestic spending.
Right.
That's interesting.
It is interesting.
Yeah, it kind of makes you think about, like, how sustainable is an economy
Yeah.
if it's mostly driven by exports,
Right.
right? Like, what if the rest of the world suddenly stops wanting your stuff?
Right.
But if you have a really strong domestic market,
Yeah.
that can be a much more stable foundation for growth.
Yeah.
And it makes you less vulnerable to these, like, ups and downs in global demand.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And there were some users in the thread talking about potential government stimulus measures in China.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like Sodalaware and War Important 9685 were mentioning that.
Yeah, we see these kind of debates happening in a lot of big economies, right?
Right.
About how to stimulate spending.
Yeah.
And War Report 9685 also brought up China's high savings rate.
Oh, wow.
Which, is often seen as a good thing, but it could also mean that people aren't spending as much.
Right.
And that can affect neighboring economies that rely on Chinese consumers.
That's a good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. And then the whole conversation on Reddit sort of shifted to the bigger geopolitical picture.
Okay.
And this user, Miaoyin8964, brought up how China is exporting more and more to countries like Morocco and Vietnam. And they were suggesting that this could lead to those countries becoming economically dependent on China.
Oh, I see.
And give Beijing more power on the geopolitical stage.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. But then you have Adembarras35666 who comes in and offers, like, a really important counter argument.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like, they remind us that a lot of these countries have a history with Western powers.
Right.
And that history isn't great.
No.
So they might actually see China's involvement in a more positive light.
Interesting.
It's like maybe they see China as a more reliable partner.
Yeah.
Because China hasn't done the same things that the West has done.
Yeah, the colonization and stuff.
Exactly. Like, they haven't been directly colonizing or intervening militarily in the same way.
Right.
So I think this really shows how history and trust, or the lack of it, can really shape relationships between countries.
It's a really, really important point, especially because then later on in the thread, right, Influence617 argues that, the West has its own history, but China in 2025 is not necessarily like a benevolent actor either.
Right.
They could be using debt and economic power to try to become dominant themselves.
It's true. It's not a simple situation.
No, but then Adembarras35566 kind of comes back and is basically like, look, every country is looking out for itself. Yep. And for a lot of developing nations, they're making choices based on their own history and what's happening right now.
Absolutely. So it goes way beyond just the numbers.
Yeah.
And into these really big questions about power.
Right.
Like, who has it? Who's trying to get it? And how does history play into all of this?
Yeah.
It's a reminder that trade isn't just about money.
Right.
It's also really political and historical.
Totally. Okay, so that's kind of the backdrop, right?
Yeah.
China's huge trade surplus and all the different ways people are interpreting it.
Yeah.
Now let's switch gears and talk about President Trump's tariffs.
Okay.
We've got some information directly from the White House.
Oh, wow.
And from Wikipedia that outlines these policies that he's put in place in his second term.
Right.
One of the key things here is this idea of a reciprocal tariff.
Okay, so can you break that down for me?
Well, they actually have a formula for it.
Oh, wow.
So it's like parentheses exports minus imports divided by imports, close parentheses times 1/2.
So what's that supposed to do?
So the Trump administration says it's all about balancing bilateral trade deficits.
Okay.
So basically they want to get to zero.
They want everything to be even.
Even Steven, yeah.
Interesting.
But pretty much right away, economists started saying, whoa, hold on a second.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like a lot of news articles and the Wikipedia entry cite all these experts who are saying that this formula is way too simple. And they're even saying that the Trump administration is misinterpreting their research.
Oh, wow.
Some of them are even comparing worrying about trade deficits with a country to worrying about having a deficit with your local supermarket.
Okay.
Like, if you're getting stuff that's worth what you're paying, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
So there was a lot of pushback.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And a lot of really strong criticism. Economists like Anson Soderberry and Brent Neiman, whose work was cited by the administration, actually came out and said that their research was being misused.
Oh, wow.
And that this formula is just wrong.
Huh.
Neiman even said that they were using the wrong variable.
Oh, no.
Which could mean that the tariffs are like 4 times higher than they should be, based on their own logic.
Yeah.
And The Economist was pretty brutal.
Oh, yeah. What did they say?
They described the formula as being almost as random as taxing you on the number of vowels in your name.
Wow, that's harsh.
Yeah.
So basically they're saying this whole thing is just nonsense.
Pretty much. But even with all of this criticism, a ton of tariffs were announced and put into effect.
Oh, wow.
Like there was a 10% universal tariff on basically everything coming into the country.
Everything.
Well, almost everything. It started on April 5th.
Okay.
Now, they did pause the elevated reciprocal tariffs for like 56 countries for 90 days, but that initial 10% stayed in place. Then you had the much higher tariffs, like 145% on all goods coming from China.
Whoa.
Which was actually an increase from what it was before.
Okay.
And it wasn't just China. There were tariffs on most goods from Canada and Mexico.
Oh, wow.
Although the ones that followed the USMCA trade agreement were exempt for a bit.
Okay.
There was also a 25% tariff on all imported cars.
Whoa.
That started right away.
Okay.
And they said that tariffs on auto parts were coming soon.
Wow.
And even something as specific as tariffs on aluminum were expanded to include things like canned beer and empty aluminum cans.
Wow, they're really going after everything.
Yeah, it's a very broad approach.
So how did other countries react to all of this?
Well, initially, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent basically said to everyone, like, hey, no retaliation allowed.
Oh, wow. Strong words.
Yeah, this was on April 3rd. But then after the stock market freaked out a little bit, it seemed like they kind of backed off on some of the more extreme tariffs.
Okay.
They announced that 90-day pause on April 9th. And Bessent said that the pause was to allow for negotiations with individual countries.
Okay.
President Trump was saying that some countries were jumping a little bit out of line and getting a little bit afraid.
Okay.
So it seems like he was watching the market reactions really closely.
Especially the bond market.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that pause did seem to give the stock market a bit of a break.
Okay, Kit.
But analysts at Citi were pointing out that even with the pause, the tariffs that stayed in place were still a big new cost for businesses and consumers.
Yeah, you would think so.
And even with the pause, Bloomberg Economics estimated that the average tariff rate in the U.S. was still going to go up quite a lot.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk about the reactions and the potential impact of all of this.
Yeah.
Because this is really having a ripple effect across the entire global economy.
Yeah. Let's start by looking at it from the perspective of those Chinese companies that are doing all the exporting.
Okay, good idea.
There was this woman, Wu Liang, from Xinyu Soxco, and she was interviewed by AP News.
Yeah.
And she was super clear. She said she would rather stop selling to the U.S. altogether than pay these really high tariffs.
Wow.
She actually said, and I quote, "At worst, we just quit.
Wow.
We will not lose money just to keep this market."
Yeah.
So, I mean, that really shows you the impact this is having right away on these businesses.
Yeah. For those smaller companies that make, cheaper consumer goods.
Right.
And they're really reliant on the U.S. market.
Yeah.
These tariffs could put them out of business.
Yeah.
So they're going to have to find other places to sell their stuff.
Right.
But as Janet Briefing points out, those other markets are already really competitive.
Yeah.
And trying to change your whole production and distribution setup, that's a huge thing to do.
Yeah. It's not easy. And what about the bigger picture for the global economy?
Well, the Federal Reserve and the OECD both lowered their forecasts for economic growth this year.
Oh, wow.
And we saw an increase in the average expectation for inflation.
Oh, no.
And the value of the U.S. dollar even went down a little.
Wow.
Yeah, by April 4th, J.P. Morgan Chase was even predicting a potential recession in the next year.
Wow.
So, yeah, these are pretty serious potential consequences.
Yeah, no kidding.
All this uncertainty created by these changing tariffs and just the general shifts in economic policy, it's made everyone nervous.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of worry about a slowdown in economic activity.
Yeah.
And rising prices for consumers.
Right. And if we zoom in on specific countries, Canada and Mexico are facing the possibility of higher prices for food and energy, especially with those tariffs on goods that didn't follow the USMCA agreement. Yeah. And then there was that weird threat from President Trump about the water from the Rio Grande.
Oh, yeah.
which just added more tension to the U.S.-Mexico relationship.
Right.
And then on top of that, the presidents of Mexico and Brazil said they were forming a joint economic front.
Oh, wow.
Which could be a response to all of this.
Yeah, that kind of regional cooperation is a really big deal.
Yeah.
And it could mean that we're going to see some new global economic alliances forming.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Taiwan got hit with a 32% tariff.
Oof.
Which led them to launch this big industrial support plan.
Okay.
And they said they were willing to negotiate with the U.S.
Okay.
The European Union also said they were going to retaliate at first. They were going to put their own tariffs on stuff coming from the U.S.
Right.
But then they mostly put that on hold for 90 days after the U.S. did that pause.
Okay.
But Ursula von der Leyen made it clear that if the talks don't go anywhere, the EU is ready to fight back.
Okay.
And she also said she was worried about China just sending all the stuff that got hit by U.S. tariffs over to Europe instead.
Well, that's a good point.
So other countries are dealing with this in different ways.
Right.
India wants to do trade talks with the U.S.
Okay.
They're not retaliating right away.
Makes sense.
Japan is worried and wants the U.S. to lower the tariffs. Singapore is worried about their own economic growth and the cost of living for their people.
Yeah.
They even made a special task force to help businesses adapt.
Wow.
And Vietnam, which has become a big exporter, is also hoping to avoid tariffs by negotiating.
Okay.
But Peter Navarro, who, he's a trade advisor to President Trump.
Right.
He's pointed out that for some countries, even if the U.S. removes the tariffs, it might not be enough if they have other concerns about unfair trade practices.
I see.
And for countries that rely a lot on clothes exports, like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, these tariffs could be a really big problem.
Yeah.
And it's not just international players that are feeling this.
Right.
Businesses and consumers here in the U.S. are also worried about rising costs.
Yeah, of course.
There are reports of automakers stopping production in some cases.
Wow.
And Nintendo even delayed pre-orders for its new Switch console in the U.S.
Oh, wow.
And the energy sector is expected to be hit hard. Like gas prices could go up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Economist Michael Hudson brought up a really interesting point.
Yeah.
He said these tariffs could destabilize the whole global financial system by making it harder for countries to pay off their debts, which are often in U.S. dollars.
Yeah.
And that could lead to a bigger debt crisis.
Like a domino effect.
Totally. And then we can't forget about the legal challenges.
Oh, right.
People are talking about lawsuits being filed to try to stop these tariffs, both here in the U.S. and in other countries. And China has already filed a complaint with the WTO.
Okay.
Another big move by the Trump administration was getting rid of the de minimis exemption for stuff coming from China and Hong Kong.
Oh, yeah. What was that all about?
So for people who don't know, this rule basically lets small shipments come into the U.S. without having to pay duties.
Okay.
So they were going to end this earlier.
Yeah.
But they had to delay it because of logistical issues. And get this, they were worried that this exemption was being used to ship illegal drugs into the country.
Oh, wow.
Including fentanyl. So the new date for this to start is May 2nd.
Okay.
And the White House is specifically connecting this to the opioid crisis.
Okay.
They say that ending the de minimis exemption will help stop shady shipping practices.
Okay.
Okay, so last but not least, let's talk a little bit about the U.S.-China dialogue.
Okay.
So there was a video call recently between the U.S. Trade Representative, Greer, and the Chinese Vice Premier, He Lifeng.
Okay.
And both sides said they were kind of interested in making a trade deal.
Okay.
But it doesn't sound like any real negotiations have started yet. And President Trump even said that maybe he would lower some tariffs if they can make a deal about TikTok.
Oh, wow.
So China Briefing is suggesting that China's own tariffs will make it harder for the U.S. to sell more stuff to China.
Right.
But they also think that China is doing this to have more power in any future trade talks and to show that they're not going to be bullied.
Yeah.
But with the huge trade imbalance that exists and how confrontational everyone's being, it seems unlikely that there's going to be a big trade deal anytime soon.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways here?
Okay, good question.
So first, China's really big trade surplus is a major reason why the U.S. is doing all these tariffs.
Right.
Second, these tariffs are not happening in a vacuum.
Right.
They're causing all kinds of reactions and worries from lots of different countries and across all sorts of industries.
Yeah.
Third, the economic and geopolitical consequences of all of this are really complicated.
Absolutely.
And we're still figuring out what they're going to be.
Yeah.
But they could affect prices, relationships between countries, and global stability.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah. And finally, at the heart of all of this are these competing economic interests.
Right.
And totally different ideas about what fair trade is. Yeah.
And how countries should use their power on the world stage.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's really complex.
It is. And I think that leads to a really important question for everyone listening.
Okay.
So given how connected the global economy is,
Yeah.
how do you think these trade tensions will change things in the long run?
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking about the specific tariffs.
Right.
I'm talking about the big picture.
Yeah.
Like, how will this change international trade?
Yeah.
And who has power globally?
Yeah.
Think about the big players like the U.S. and China.
Yeah.
But also think about all the smaller countries that are stuck in the middle of all of this.
Yeah.
How are they going to navigate this?
Yeah.
Because it's a really uncertain world right now.
It really is.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's it for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
This is The Deep Dive.
See you next time.